Chapter 14 of the Metropolis by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Montague had written a reluctant letter to Major Thorne, telling him that he had been unable to interest anyone in his proposition, and that he was not in a position to undertake it himself. Then, according to his brother's injunction, he left his money in the bank and waited. There would be something doing soon, said Oliver. And as they drove home from the Evans, Oliver served notice upon him that this event might be expected any day. He was very mysterious about it, and would answer none of his brother's questions, except to say that it had nothing to do with the people they had just visited. "I suppose," Montague remarked, "you have not failed to realize that Evans might play you false?" And the other laughed, echoing the words, "might do it." Then he went on to tell the tale of a great railroad builder of the West, whose daughter had been married with elaborate festivities, and some of the young men present, thinking to find him in a sentimental mood, had asked him for his views about the market. He advised them to buy the stock of his road, and they formed a pool and bought, and as fast as they bought he sold, until that little venture cost the boys a total of $7,500,000. "No, no," Oliver added, "I have never put up a dollar for anything of Evans, and I never shall. There is simply a side issue, anyway," he added carelessly. A couple of mornings later, while Montague was at breakfast, his brother called him up and said he was coming round, and would go downtown with him. Montague knew at once that that meant something serious, for he had never before known his brother to be awake so early. They took a cab, and then Oliver explained. The moment had arrived, the time to take the plunge and come up with a fortune. He could not tell much about it, for it was a matter upon which he stood pledged to absolute secrecy. There were but 4 people in the country who knew about it. It was the chance of a lifetime, and in 4 or 5 hours it would be gone. 3 times before it had come to Oliver, and each time he had multiplied his capital several times. That he had not made millions was simply because he did not have enough money. His brother must take his word for this, and simply put himself into his hands. "What is it you want me to do?" asked Montague gravely. "I want you to take every dollar you have, or that you can lay your hands on this morning, and turn it over to me to buy stocks with." "To buy on margin, you mean?" "Of course I mean that," said Oliver. Then, as he saw his brother frown, he added, "Understand me. I have absolutely certain information as to how a certain stock will behave today." "The best judges of a stock often make mistakes in such matters," said Montague. "It is not a question of any person's judgment," was the reply. "It is a question of knowledge. The stock is to be made to behave so." "But how can you know that the person who intends to make it behave may not be lying to you?" "My information does not come from that person, but from a person who has no such interest, who, on the contrary, is in on the deal with me, and gains only as I gain." "Then, in other words," said Montague, "your information is stolen?" "Everything in Wall Street is stolen," was Oliver's concise reply. There was a long silence, while the cab rolled swiftly on its way. "Well?" Oliver asked at last. "I can imagine," said Montague, "how a man might intend to move a certain stock, and think that he had the power, and yet find that he was mistaken. There are so many forces, so many chances to be considered. It seems to me you must be taking a risk." Oliver laughed. "You talk like a child," was his reply. "Suppose that I were in absolute control of a corporation, and that I chose to run it for purposes of market manipulation. Don't you think I might come pretty near knowing what its stock was going to do?" "Yes," said Montague slowly, "if such a thing as that were conceivable." "If it were conceivable?" laughed his brother. "And now suppose that I had a confidential man, a secretary, we'll say, and I paid him $20,000 a year, and he saw chances to make 100,000 in an hour. Don't you think he might conceivably try it?" "Yes," said Montague, "he might. But where do you come in?" "Well, if the man were going to do anything worth while, he'd need capital, would he not? And he'd hardly dare to look for any money in the street, where 1,000 eyes would be watching him. What more natural than to look out for some person who is in society and has the ear of private parties with plenty of cash?" And Montague sat in deep thought. "I see," he said slowly, "I see." Then fixing his eyes upon Oliver, he exclaimed earnestly, "One thing more." "Don't ask me any more," protested the other. "I told you I was pledged." "You must tell me this," said Montague. "Does Bobby Walling know about it?" "He does not," was the reply. But Montague had known his brother long and intimately, and he could read things in his eyes. He knew that that was a lie. He had solved the mystery at last. Montague knew that he had come to a parting of the ways. He did not like this kind of thing. He had not come to New York to be a stock gambler. But what a difficult thing it would be to say so, and how unfair it was to be confronted with such an issue, and compelled to decide in a few minutes in a cab. He had put himself in his brother's hands, and now he was under obligations to him, which he could not pay off. Oliver had paid all his expenses, and he was doing everything for him. He had made all his difficulties his own, and in all frankness and perfect trust, upon the assumption that his brother would play the game with him. And now, at the critical moment, he was to face about and say, "I do not like the game. I do not approve of your life." Such a painful thing it is to have a higher moral code than one's friends. If he refused, he saw that he would have to face a complete break. He could not go on living in the world to which he had been introduced. 50,000 had seemed an enormous fee, yet even a week or two had sufficed for it to come to seem inadequate. He would have to have many such fees, if they were to go on living at their present rate, and if Alice were to have a social career and entertain her friends. And to ask Alice to give up now and retire would be even harder than to face his brother here in the cab. Then came the temptation. Life was a battle, and this was the way it was being fought. If he rejected the opportunity, others would seize it. In fact, by refusing, he would be handing it to them. This great man, whoever he might be, was manipulating stocks for his own convenience. Could anyone in his senses reject a chance to wrench from him some part of his spoils? Montague saw the impulse of refusing dying away within him. "Well?" asked his brother finally. "Oliver," said the other, "don't you think that I ought to know more about it, so that I can judge?" "You could not judge, even if I told you all," said Oliver. "It would take you a long time to become familiar with the circumstances, as I am. You must take my word. I know it is certain and safe." Then suddenly he unbuttoned his coat, and took out some papers, and handed his brother a telegram. It was dated Chicago, and read, "Guest is expected immediately. Henry." "That means by transcontinental this morning," said Oliver. "I see," said the other. "Then the man is in Chicago?" "No," was the reply. "That is his wife. He wires to her." "How much money have you?" asked Oliver, after a pause. "I've most of the 50,000," the other answered, "and about 30,000 we brought with us." "How much can you put your hands on?" "Why, I could get all of it, but part of the money is mother's, and I would not touch that." The younger man was about to remonstrate, but Montague stopped him. "I will put up the 50,000 I have earned," he said. "I dare not risk any more." Oliver shrugged his shoulders. "As you please," he said. "You may never have another such chance in your life." He dropped the subject, or at least he probably tried to. Within a few minutes, however, he was back at it again, with the result that by the time they reached the banking district, Montague had agreed to draw 60,000. They stopped at his bank. "It isn't open yet," said Oliver, "but the paying teller will oblige you. Tell him you want it before the exchange opens." Montague went in and got his money in 6 new, crisp $10,000 bills. He buttoned them up in his innermost pocket, wondering a little, incidentally, at the magnificence of the place, and at the swift routine manner in which the clerk took in and paid out such sums as this. Then they drove to Oliver's bank, and he drew 120,000, and then he paid off the cab, and they strolled down Broadway into Wall Street. It lacked a quarter of an hour of the time of the opening of the exchange, and a stream of prosperous-looking men were pouring in from all the cars and ferries to their offices. "Where are your brokers?" Montague inquired. "I don't have any brokers, at least not for a matter such as this," said Oliver. And he stopped in front of one of the big buildings. "In there," he said, "are the offices of Hammond and Streeter, second floor to your left. Go there and ask for a member of the firm, and introduce yourself under an assumed name." "What?" gasped Montague. "Of course, man. You would not dream of giving your own name. What difference will that make?" "I never thought of doing such a thing," said the other. "Well, think of it now." But Montague shook his head. "I would not do that," he said. Oliver shrugged his shoulders. "All right," he said. "Tell him you don't care to give your name. They're a little shady. They'll take your money." "Suppose they won't?" asked the other. "Then wait outside for me, and I'll take you somewhere else." "What shall I buy?" 10,000 shares of Transcontinental Common at the opening price, and tell them to buy on the scale up, and to raise the stop, and also to take your orders to sell over the phone. Then wait there until I come for you." Montague set his teeth together and obeyed orders. Inside the door marked Hammond and Streeter, a pleasant-faced young man advanced to meet him, and led him to a gray-haired and affable gentleman, Mr. Streeter. And Montague introduced himself as a stranger in town, from the South, and wishing to buy some stock. Mr. Streeter led him into an inner office, and seated himself at a desk, and drew some papers in front of him. "Your name, please?" he asked. "I don't care to give my name," replied the other, and Mr. Streeter put down his pen. "Not give your name?" he said. "No," said Montague quietly. "Why?" said Mr. Streeter. "I don't understand." "I'm a stranger in town," said Montague, "and not accustomed to dealing in stocks. I should prefer to remain unknown." The man eyed him sharply. "Where do you come from?" he asked. "From Mississippi," was the reply. "And have you a residence in New York?" "At a hotel," said Montague. "You have to give some name," said the other. "Any will do," said Montague. "John Smith, if you like." "We never do anything like this," said the broker. "We require that our customers be introduced. There are rules of the exchange. There are rules." "I am sorry," said Montague. "This would be a cash transaction." "How many shares do you want to buy?" 10,000 was the reply. Mr. Streeter became more serious. "That is a large order," he said. Montague said nothing. "What do you wish to buy?" was the next question. "Transcontinental Common," he replied. "Well," said the other after another pause, "we will try to accommodate you, but you will have to consider it strictly confidential," said Montague. So Mr. Streeter made out the papers, and Montague, looking them over, discovered that they called for $100,000. "That is a mistake," he said. "I have only 60,000. "Oh," said the other, "we shall certainly have to charge you a 10% margin." Montague was not prepared for this contingency, but he did some mental arithmetic. "What is the present price of the stock?" he asked. 59 5/8 was the reply. "Then $60,000 is more than 10% of the market price," said Montague. "Yes," said Mr. Streeter, "but in dealing with a stranger we shall certainly have to put a stop loss order at 4 points above, and that would leave you only 2 points of safety. Surely not enough." "I see," said Montague, and he had a sudden appalling realization of the wild game which his brother had planned for him. "Whereas," Mr. Streeter continued persuasively, "if you put up 10%, you will have 6 points." "Very well," said the other promptly. "Then please buy me 6,000 shares." So they closed the deal, and the papers were signed, and Mr. Streeter took the 6 new crisp $10,000 bills. Then he escorted him to the outer office, remarking pleasantly on the way, "I hope you're well advised. We are inclined to be bearish upon Transcontinental ourselves. The situation looks rather squally." These words were not worth the breath it took to say them, but Montague was not aware of this, and felt a painful start within. But he answered carelessly that one must take his chances, and sat down in one of the customers' chairs. Hammond & Streeter's was like a little lecture hall, with rows of seats and a big blackboard in front, with the initials of most of the important stocks in columns, and yesterday's closing prices above, on little green cards. At one side was a ticker, with 2 attendants awaiting the opening click. In the seats were 20 or 30 men, old and young, most of them regular habitués, victims of the fever of the street. Montague watched them, catching snatches of their whispered conversation, with its intricate and disagreeable slang. He felt intensely humiliated and uncomfortable, for he had got the fever of the street into his own veins, and he could not conquer it. There were nasty shivers running up and down his spine, and his hands were cold. He stared at the little figures, fascinated, for they stood for some vast and tremendous force outside, which could not be controlled or even comprehended. Some merciless, annihilating force, like the lightning or the tornado, and he had put himself at the mercy of it. It might do its will with him. "TRC 59 5/8" read the little pasteboard, and he had only 6 points of safety. If at any time in the day the figure should be changed to read 53 5/8, then every dollar of Montague's 60,000 would be gone forever. The great fee that he had worked so hard for, and rejoiced so greatly over, that would be all gone, and a slice out of his inheritance besides. A boy put into his hand a little 4-page paper, one of the countless news sheets which different houses and interests distributed free for advertising or other purposes, and a heading, "Transcontinental," caught his eye among the paragraphs in the day's events. He read: "The directors' meeting of the Transcontinental R.R. will be held at noon. It is confidently predicted that the quarterly dividend will be passed, as it has been for the last 3 quarters. There is great dissatisfaction among the stockholders. The stock has been decidedly weak, with no apparent inside support. It fell off 3 points just before closing yesterday upon the news of further proceedings by the Western State officials, and widely credited rumors of dissension among the directors, with renewed opposition to the control of the Hopkins interests." 10 o'clock came and went, and the ticker began its long journey. There was intense activity in Transcontinental, many thousands of shares changing hands, and the price swaying back and forth. When Oliver came in a half an hour, it stood at 59 3/8. "That's all right," said he. "Our time will not come till afternoon." "But suppose we are wiped out before afternoon?" said the other. "That is impossible," answered Oliver. "There will be big buying all the morning." They sat for a while, nervous and restless. Then, by way of breaking the monotony, Oliver suggested that his brother might like to see the street. They went around the corner to Broad Street. Here at the head stood the sub-treasury building, with all the gold of the government inside and a Gatling gun in the tower. The public did not know it was there, but the financial men knew it, and it seemed as if they had huddled all their offices and banks and safe deposit vaults under its shelter. Here, far underground, were hidden 200 millions of securities of the Oil Trust in a huge 600-ton steel vault, with a door so delicately poised that a finger could swing it on its hinges. And opposite to this was the white Grecian building of the Stock Exchange. Down the street were throngs of men within a roped area, pushing, shouting, jostling. This was the curb, where one could buy or sell small blocks of stock, and all the wildcat mining and oil stocks which were not listed by the exchange. Rain or shine, these men were always here, and in the windows of the neighboring buildings stood others, shouting quotations to them through megaphones, or signaling in deaf and dumb language. Some of these brokers wore colored hats so that they could be distinguished. Some had offices far off, where men sat all day with strong glasses trained upon them. Everywhere was the atmosphere of speculation, the restless, feverish eyes, the quick, nervous gestures, the haggard, careworn faces. For in this game every man was pitted against every other man, and the dice were loaded so that 9 out of every 10 were doomed in advance to ruin and defeat. They procured passes to the visitors' gallery of the exchange. From here one looked down into a room 100 or 200 feet square, its floor covered with a snowstorm of torn pieces of paper, and its air a babel of shouts and cries. Here were gathered perhaps 2,000 men and boys. Some were lounging and talking, but most were crowded about the various trading posts, pushing, climbing over each other, leaping up, waving their hands and calling aloud. A seat in this exchange was worth about $95,000, and so no one of these men was poor. But yet they came day after day to play their parts in this sordid arena, seeking in sorrow for each other's joy, inventing 1,000 petty tricks to outwit and deceive each other, rejoicing in 1,000 petty triumphs, and spending their lives like the waves upon the shore, a very symbol of human futility. Now and then a sudden impulse would seize them, and they would become like howling demons, surging about one spot, shrieking, gasping, clawing each other's clothing to pieces, and the spectator shuddered, seeing them as victims of some strange and dreadful enchantment, which bound them to struggle and torment each other until they were worn out and gray. But one felt these things only dimly, when he had put all his fortune into transcontinental common. For then he had sold his own soul to the enchanter, and the spell was upon him, and he hoped and feared and agonized with the struggling throng. Montague had no need to ask which was his post, for a mob of 100 men were packed about it, with little whirls and eddies here and there on the outside. "Something doing today, all right," said a man in his ear. It was interesting to watch, but there was one difficulty. There were no quotations provided for the spectators, so the sight of this activity merely set them on edge with anxiety. Something must be happening to their stock. Even Oliver was visibly nervous. After all, in the surest cases, the game was a dangerous one. There might be a big failure, or an assassination, or an earthquake. They rushed out and made for the nearest broker's office, where a glance at the board showed them Transcontinental at 60. They drew a long breath and sat down again to wait. That was about 11:30. At 11:45, the stock went up an eighth, and then a quarter, and then another eighth. The two gripped their hands in excitement. Had the time come? Apparently it had. A minute later The stock leaped to 61, on large buying. Then it went 3/8 more. A buzz of excitement ran through the office, and the old-timers sat up in their seats. The stock went another quarter. Montague heard a man behind him say to his neighbor, "What does it mean?" "God knows," was the answer, but Oliver whispered in his brother's ear, "I know what it means. The insiders are buying." Somebody was buying, and buying furiously. The ticker seemed to set all other business aside and give its attention to the trading in Transcontinental. It was like a baseball game when one side begins to pile up runs, and the man in the coach's box chants exultingly, and the dullest spectator is stirred, since no man can be indifferent to success. And as the stock went higher and higher, a little wave of excitement mounted with it, a murmur running through the room, and a thrill passing from person to person. Some watched, wondering if it would last, and if they had not better take on a little, and then another point would be scored, and they would wish they had done it, and hesitate whether to do it now. But to others, like the Montagues, who had some, it was victory, glorious and thrilling. Their pulses leaped faster with every new change of the figures, and between times they reckoned up their gains, and hung between hope and dread for new gains, which were on the way but not yet in sight. There was a little lull, and the boys who tended the board had a chance to rest. The stock was above 66, at which price, owing to the device of pyramiding, Montague was on velvet, to use the picturesque phrase of the street. His earnings amounted to $60,000, and even if the stock were to fall, and he were to be sold out, he would lose nothing. He wished to sell and realize his profits, but his brother gripped him fast by the arm. "No, no," he said, "it hasn't really come yet." Some went out to lunch, to a restaurant where they could have a telephone on their table, so as to keep in touch with events. But the Montagues had no care about eating. They sat picturing the directors in session, and speculating upon a score of various eventualities. Things might yet go wrong, and all their profits would vanish like early snowflakes, and all their capital with them. Oliver shook like a leaf, but he would not stir. "Stay game," he whispered. He took out his watch and glanced at it. It was after 2 o'clock. "It may go over till tomorrow," he muttered. But then suddenly came the storm. The ticker recorded a rise in price of Transcontinental of 1.5 points upon a purchase of 5,000 shares, and then 0.5 point for 2,000 more. After that it never stopped. It went a point at a time. It went 10 points in about 15 minutes. A babel broke loose in the office, and in several thousand other offices in the street, and spread to others all over the world. Montague had got up, and was moving here and there, because the tension was unendurable. And at the door of an inner office he heard someone at the telephone exclaiming, "For the love of God, can't you find out what's the matter?" A moment later a man rushed in, breathless and wild-eyed, and his voice rang through the office. "The directors have declared a quarterly dividend of 3%, and an extra dividend of 2." Oliver caught his brother by the arm and started for the door with him. "Get to your brokers," he said, "and if the stock has stopped moving, sell, and sell in any case before the close." And then he dashed away to his own headquarters. At about 3:30 o'clock, Oliver came in to Hammond and Streeter's, breathless, and with his hair and clothing disheveled. He was half beside himself with exultation, and Montague was scarcely less wrought up. In fact, he felt quite limp after the strain he had been through. "What price did you get?" his brother inquired, and he answered, "An average of 78 3/8." There had been another sharp rise at the end, and he had sold all his stock without checking the advance. "I got 5/8", said Oliver. "Oh, ye gods!" There were some unhappy shorts in the office. Mr. Streeter was one of them. It was bitterness and gall to them to see the radiant faces of the two lucky ones. But the two did not even see this. They went out half dancing, and had a drink or two to steady their nerves. They would not actually get their money until the morrow, but Montague figured a profit of a trifle under $250,000 for himself. Of this, about 20,000 would go to make up the share of his unknown informant. The balance, he considered, would be an ample reward for his 6 hours' work that day. His brother had won more than twice as much. But as they drove up home, talking it over in awe-stricken whispers, and pledging themselves to absolute secrecy, Oliver suddenly clenched his fist and struck his knee. "By God!" he exclaimed. "If I hadn't been a fool and tried to save an extra margin, I could have had $1 million." End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of the Metropolis by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. After such a victory, one felt in a mood for Christmas festivities, for music and dancing, and all beautiful and happy things. Such a thing, for instance, as Mrs. Winnie, when she came to meet him, clad in her best automobile coat, a thing of purest snowy ermine, so truly gorgeous that wherever she went, people turned and stared and caught their breath. Mrs. Winnie was a picture of joyful health, with a glow in her rich complexion and a sparkle in her black eyes. She sat in her big touring car, in which one could afford to wear ermine. It was a little private self-moving hotel. In the limousine were seats for 6 persons, with revolving easy chairs, and berths for sleeping, and a writing desk, and a washstand, and a beautiful electric chandelier to light it at night. Its trimmings were of South American mahogany, and its upholstering of Spanish and Morocco leathers. It had a telephone with which one spoke to the driver, an icebox, and a lunch hamper. In fact, one might have spent an hour discovering new gimcracks in this magic automobile. It had been made especially for Mrs. Winnie a couple of years ago, and the newspaper said it had cost $30,000. It had then been quite a novelty, but now everybody was getting them. In this car one might sit at ease, and laugh and chat and travel at the rate of an express train, and with never a jar or a quiver, nor the faintest sound of any sort. The streets of the city sped by them as if by enchantment. They went through the park, and out Riverside Drive, and up the river road which runs out of Broadway all the way to Albany. It was a macadamized avenue, lined with beautiful and stately homes. As one went farther yet, he came to the great country estates, a whole district of hundreds of square miles given up to them. There were forests and lakes and streams. There were gardens and greenhouses filled with rare plants and flowers, and parks with deer browsing, and peacocks and lyre birds strutting about. The road wound in and out among hills, the surface of which would become one unbroken lawn, and upon the highest points stood palaces of every conceivable style and shape. One might find these great domains anywhere around the city, at a distance of from 30 to 60 miles. There were 200 or 300 of them, and incredible were the sums of money which had been spent upon their decoration. One saw an artificial lake of 10,000 acres, made upon land which had cost several $100s an acre. One saw gardens with 10,000 rose bushes and $250,000 worth of lilies from Japan. There was one estate in which had been planted $1 million worth of rare trees, imported from all over the world. Some rich men, who had nothing else to amuse them, would make their estates over and over again, changing the view about their homes as one changes the scenery in a play. Over in New Jersey the Hagans were building a castle upon a mountain top, and had built a special railroad simply to carry the materials. Here also was the estate of the Tobacco King, upon which $3,000,000 had been spent before the plans of the mansion had ever been drawn. There were artificial lakes and streams, and fantastic bridges and statuary, and scores of little model plantations and estates, according to the whim of the owner. And here in Pocanto Hills was the estate of the Oil King, about 4 square miles, with 30 miles of model driveways. Many carloads of rare plants had been imported for its gardens, and it took 600 men to keep it in order. There was a golf course, a little miniature Alps, upon which the richest man in the world pursued his lost health, with armed guards and detectives patrolling the place all day, and a tower with a searchlight whereby at night he could flood the grounds with light by pressing a button. In one of these places lived the heir of the great house of Devon. His cousin dwelt in Europe, saying that America was not a fit place for a gentleman to live in. Each of them owned $100,000,000 worth of New York real estate, and drew their tributes of rents from the toil of the swarming millions of the city. And always, according to the policy of the family, they bought new real estate. They were directors of the great railroads tributary to the city, and in touch with the political machines, and in every other way in position to know what was under way. If a new subway were built to set the swarming millions free, the millions would find the land all taken up and apartment houses newly built for them. And the Devons were the owners. They had a score of the city's greatest hotels, and also slum tenements, and brothels and dives in the Tenderloin. They did not even have to know what they owned. They did not have to know anything or do anything. They lived in their palaces, at home or abroad, and in their offices in the city the great rent-gathering machine ground on. Eldridge Devon's occupation was playing with his country place and his automobiles. He had recently sold all his horses, and turned his stables into a garage equipped with a score or so of cars. He was always getting a new one and discussing its merits. As to Hudson Cliff, the estate, he had conceived the brilliant idea of establishing a gentleman's country place, which should be self-supporting, that is to say, which should furnish the luxuries and necessities of its owner's table for no more than it would have cost to buy them. Considering the prices usually paid, this was no astonishing feat, but Devon took a child's delight in it. He showed Montague his greenhouses, filled with rare flowers and fruits, and his model dairy, with marble stables and nickel plumbing, and attendants in white uniforms and rubber gloves. He was a short and very stout gentleman with red cheeks, and his conversation was not too brilliant. To Hudson Cliff came many of Montague's earlier acquaintances, and others whom he had not met before. They amused themselves in all the ways with which he had become familiar at house parties. Likewise on Christmas Eve there were festivities for the children, and on Christmas night a costume ball, very beautiful and stately. Many came from New York to attend this, and others from the neighborhood, and in returning calls Montague saw others of these hilltop mansions. Also, and most important of all, they played bridge, as they had played at every function which he had attended so far. Here Mrs. Winnie, who had rather taken him up, and threatened to supplant Oliver as his social guide and chaperone, insisted that no more excuses would be accepted. So for 2 mornings he sat with her in one of the sun parlors, and diligently put his mind upon the game. As he proved an apt pupil, he was then advised that he might take a trial plunge. And so Montague came into touch with a new social phenomenon, perhaps on the whole the most significant and soul-disturbing phenomenon which society had exhibited to him. He had just had the experience of getting a great deal of money without earning it, and was fresh from the disagreeable memories of it, the trembling and suspense, the burning, lustful greed, the terrible, nerve-devouring excitement. He had hoped that he would not soon have to go through such an experience again, and here was the prospect of an endless dalliance with it. For that was the meaning of bridge. It was a penalty which people were paying for getting their money without earning it. The disease got into their blood, and they could no longer live without the excitement of gain and the hope of gain. Soon after their labors were over, when they were supposed to be resting and enjoying themselves, they would get together and torment themselves with an imitation struggle, mimicking the grim and dreadful gamble of business. Down in the street, Oliver had pointed out to his brother a celebrated plunger who had sometimes won 6 or 8 millions in a single day, and that man would play at stocks all morning and play the ponies in the afternoon, and then spend the evening in a millionaire's gambling house. And so it was with the bridge fiends. It was a social plague. It had run through all society, high and low. It had destroyed conversation and all good fellowship. It would end by destroying even common decency and turning the best people into vulgar gamblers. Thus spoke Mrs. Billy Alden, who was one of the guests, and Montague thought that Mrs. Billy ought to know, for she herself was playing all the time. Mrs. Billy did not like Mrs. Winnie Duval, and the beginnings of the conversation was her inquiry why he had let that woman corrupt him. Then the good lady went on to tell him what bridge had come to be, how people played it on the trains all the way from New York to San Francisco, how they had tables in their autos, and played while they were touring over the world. Once, said she, I took a party to see the America's Cup races off Sandy Hook, and when we got back to the pier, someone called, "Who won?" And the answer was, "Mrs. Billy's ahead, but we're going on this evening." I took a party of friends through the Mediterranean and up the Nile, and we passed Venice and Cairo and the Pyramids and the Suez Canal, and they never once looked up. They were playing bridge. And you think I'm joking, but I mean just literally what I say. I know a man who was traveling from New York to Philadelphia, and got into a game with some strangers, and rode all the way to Palm Beach to finish it. Montague heard later of a well-known society leader who was totally incapacitated that winter from too much bridge at Newport, and she was passing the winter at Hot Springs and Palm Beach and playing bridge there. They played it even in sanitariums, to which they had been driven by nervous breakdown. It was an occupation so exhausting to the physique of women that physicians came to know the symptoms of it, and before they diagnosed a case they would ask, "Do you play bridge?" It had destroyed the last remnants of the Sabbath. It was a universal custom to have card parties on that day. It was a very expensive game, as they played it in society. One might easily win or lose several $1,000s in an evening, and there were many who could not afford this. If one did not play, he would be dropped from the lists of those invited, and when one entered a game, etiquette required him to stay in until it was finished. So one heard of young girls who had pawned their family plate or had sold their honor to pay their bills at the game, and all society knew of one youth who had robbed his hostess of her jewels and pawned them, and then taken her to tickets, telling her that her guests had robbed him. There were women received in the best society who lived as adventuresses, pure and simple, upon their skill at the game. Hostesses would invite rich guests and fleece them. Montague never forgot the sense of amazement and dismay with which he listened while first Mrs. Winnie and then his brother warned him that he must avoid playing with a certain aristocratic dame, whom he met in this most aristocratic household, because she was such a notorious cheater. "My dear fellow," laughed his brother when he protested, We have a phrase to cheat at cards like a woman." And then Oliver went on to tell him of his own first experience at cards in society, when he had played poker with several charming young debutantes. They would call their hands and take the money without showing their cards, and he had been too gallant to ask to see them. But later he learned that this was a regular practice, and so he never played poker with women. And Oliver pointed out one of these girls to his brother, sitting as beautiful as a picture and as cold as marble, with a half-smoked cigarette on the edge of the table, and a whiskey and soda and glasses of cracked ice beside her. Later on, as he chanced to be reading a newspaper, his brother leaned over his shoulder and pointed out another of the symptoms of the craze, an advertisement headed, "Your Luck Will Change." It gave notice that at Rosenstein's parlors, just off Fifth Avenue, one might borrow money upon expensive gowns and furs. All during the 10 days of this house party, Mrs. Winnie devoted herself to seeing that Montague had a good time. Mrs. Winnie sat beside him at table. He found that somehow a convention had been established which assigned him to Mrs. Winnie as a matter of course. Nobody said anything to him about it, but knowing how relentlessly the affairs of other people were probed and analyzed, he began to feel exceedingly uncomfortable. There came a time when he felt quite smothered by Mrs. Winnie, and immediately after lunch one day he broke away and went for a long walk by himself. This was the occasion of his meeting with an adventure. An inch or two of snow had fallen and lay gleaming in the sunlight. The air was keen, and he drank deep draughts of it, and went striding away over the hills for an hour or so. There was a gale blowing, and as he came over the summits it would strike him, and he would see the river white with foam. And then down in the valleys again all would be still. Here, in a thickly wooded place, Montague's attention was arrested suddenly by a peculiar sound, a heavy thud, which seemed to shake the earth. It suggested a distant explosion, and he stopped for a moment, and then went on, gazing ahead. He passed a turn, and then he saw a great tree which had fallen directly across the road. He went on, thinking that this was what he had heard, but as he came nearer, he saw his mistake. Beyond the tree lay something else, and he began to run toward it. It was 2 wheels of an automobile sticking up into the air. He sprang upon the tree trunk, and in one glance he saw the whole story. A big touring car had swept round a sharp turn, and swerved to avoid the unexpected obstruction, and so turned a somersault into the ditch. Montague gave a thrill of horror, for there was the form of a man pinned beneath the body of the car. He sprang toward it, but a second glance made him stop. He saw that blood had gushed from the man's mouth and soaked the snow all about. His chest was visibly crushed flat. His eyes were dreadful, half started from their sockets. For a moment Montague stood staring as if turned to stone. Then from the other side of the car came a moan, and he ran toward the sound. A second man lay in the ditch, moving feebly. Montague sprang to help him. The man wore a heavy bearskin coat. Montague lifted him, and saw that he was a very elderly person, with a cut across his forehead and a face as white as chalk. The other helped him to a position with his back against the bank, and he opened his eyes and groaned. Montague knelt beside him, watching his breathing. He had a sense of utter helplessness. There was nothing he could think of to do, save to unbutton the man's coat and keep wiping the blood from his face. "Some whiskey," the stranger moaned. Montague answered that he had none, but the other replied that there was some in the car. The slope of the bank was such that Montague could crawl under and find the compartment with the bottle in it. The old man drank some, and a little color came back to his face. As the other watched him, it came to him that his face was familiar, but he could not place it. "How many were there with you?" Montague asked, And the man answered, "Only one." Montague went over and made certain that the other man, who was obviously the chauffeur, was dead. Then he hurried down the road and dragged some brush into the middle of it, where it could be seen from a distance by any other automobile that came along, after which he went back to the stranger and bound his handkerchief about his forehead to stop the bleeding from the cut. The old man's lips were tightly set, as if he were suffering great pain. "I'm done for," he moaned again and again. "Where are you hurt?" Montague asked. "I don't know," he gasped, "but it's finished me. I know it. It's the last straw." Then he closed his eyes and lay back. "Can't you get a doctor?" he asked. "There are no houses very near," said Montague, "but I can run." "No, no," the other interrupted anxiously. "Don't leave me. Someone will come. Oh, that fool of a chauffeur! Why couldn't he go slow when I told him? That's always the way with them. They're always trying to show off." "The man is dead," said Montague quietly. The other started upon his elbow. "Dead?" he gasped. "Yes," said Montague. "He's under the car." The old man's eyes had started wild with fright, and he caught Montague by the arm. "Dead?" he said. "Oh, my God! And it might have been me!" There was a moment's pause. The stranger caught his breath and whispered again, "I'm done for. I can't stand it. It's too much." Montague had noticed when he lifted the man that he was very frail and slight of build. Now he could feel that the hand that held his arm was trembling violently. It occurred to him that perhaps the man was not really hurt, but that his nerves had been upset by the shock. And he felt certain of this a moment later, when the stranger suddenly leaned forward, clutching him with redoubled intensity and staring at him with wide, horror-stricken eyes. "Do you know what it means to be afraid of death?" he panted. "Do you know what it means to be afraid of death?" Then, without waiting for a reply, he rushed on. "No, no, you can't, you can't! I don't believe any man knows it as I do. Think of it, for 10 years I've never known a minute when I wasn't afraid of death. It follows me around. It won't let me be. It leaps out at me in places like this, and when I can escape it, I can hear it laughing at me, for it knows I can't get away." The old man caught his breath with a choking sob. He was clinging to Montague like a frightened child, and staring with a wild, hunted look upon his face. Montague sat transfixed. "Yes," the other rushed on, "that's the truth, as God hears me. And it is the first time I've ever spoken of it in my life. I have to hide it, because men would laugh at me. They pretend they're not afraid. But I lie awake at night, and it's like a fiend that sits by my bedside. I lie and listen to my own heart. I feel it beating, and I think how weak it is, and what thin walls it has, and what a wretched, helpless thing it is to have your life depend on that. You don't know what that is, I suppose." Montague shook his head. "You're young, you see," said the other. "You have health. Everybody has health except me. And everybody hates me. I haven't got a friend in the world." Montague was quite taken back by the suddenness of this outburst. He tried to stop it, for he felt almost indecent in listening. It was not fair to take a man off his guard like this. But the stranger could not be stopped. He was completely unstrung, and his voice grew louder and louder. "It's every word of it true," he exclaimed wildly, "and I can't stand it any more. I can't stand anything any more. I was young and strong once. I could take care of myself, and I said, 'I'll make money. I'll be master of other men.' But I was a fool. I forgot my health. And now all the money on earth can't do me any good. I'd give $10 million today for a body like any other man's, and this is what I have." He struck his hands against his bosom. "Look at it!" he cried hysterically. "This is what I've got to live in. It won't digest any food, and I can't keep it warm. There's nothing right with it. How would you like to lie awake at night and say to yourself that your teeth were decaying and you couldn't help it? Your hair was falling out and nobody could stop it. You're old and worn out, falling to pieces, and everybody hates you. Everybody's waiting for you to die, so that they can get you out of the way. The doctors come, and they're all humbugs. They shake their heads and use long words. They know they can't do you any good, but they want their big fees. And all they do is to frighten you worse and make you sicker than ever." There was nothing that Montague could do save to sit and listen to this outburst of wretchedness. His attempts to soothe the old man only had the effect of exciting him more. "Why does it have to fall on me?" he moaned. "I want to be like other people. I want to live. And instead I'm like a man with a pack of hungry wolves prowling round him. That's what it's like. It's like nature, hungry and cruel and savage. You think you know what life is. It seems so beautiful and gentle and pleasant. That's when you're on top. But now I'm down, and I know what it is. It's a thing like a nightmare that reaches out for you to clutch you and crush you, and you can't get away from it. You're helpless as a rat in a corner. You're damned! You're damned!" The miserable man's voice broke into a cry of despair, and he sank down in a heap in front of Montague, shaking and sobbing. The other was trembling slightly and stricken with awe. There was a long silence, and then the stranger lifted his tear-stained face, and Montague helped to support him. "Have a little more of the whiskey," said he. "No," the other answered feebly, "I'd better not." "My doctors won't let me have whiskey," he added, after a while. "That's my liver. I've so many don'ts, you know, that it takes a notebook to keep track of them. And all of them together do me no good. Think of it. I have to live on graham crackers and milk. Actually, not a thing has passed my lips for 2 years but graham crackers and milk." And then suddenly, with a start, it came to Montague where he had seen this wrinkled old face before. It was Laura Hegan's uncle, whom the Major had pointed out to him in the dining room of the Millionaires' Club. Old Henry S. Grimes, who was really only 60 but looked 80, and who owned slum tenements and evicted more people in a month than could be crowded into the clubhouse. Montague gave no sign, but sat holding the man in his arms. A trickle of blood came from under the handkerchief and ran down his cheek. Montague felt him tremble as he touched this with his ringer. "Is it much of a cut?" he asked. "Not much," said Montague. 2 or 3 stitches, perhaps." "Send for my family physician," the other added. "If I should faint or anything, you'll find his name in my card case. What's that?" There was the sound of voices down the road. "Hello!" Montague shouted, and a moment later 2 men in automobile costume came running toward him. They stopped, staring in dismay at the sight which confronted them. At Montague's suggestion, they made haste to find a log, by means of which they lifted the auto sufficiently to drag out the body of the chauffeur. Montague saw that it was quite cold. He went back to old Grimes. "Where do you wish to go?" he asked. The other hesitated. "I was bound for the Harrisons," he said. "The Leslie Harrisons?" asked Montague. They were people he had met at the Devons. The other noticed his look of recognition. "Do you know them?" he asked. "I do," said Montague. "If it isn't far," said the old man, "perhaps I'd best go there." And then he hesitated for a moment, and catching Montague by the arm, and pulling him toward him, whispered, "Tell me. You won't tell?" Montague, comprehending what he meant, answered, "It will be between us." At the same time he felt a new thrill of revulsion for this most miserable old creature. They lifted him into the car, and because they delayed long enough to lay a blanket over the body of the chauffeur, he asked peevishly why they did not start. During the 10 or 15 minutes' trip he sat clinging to Montague, shuddering with fright every time they rounded a turn in the road. They reached the Harrisons' place, and the footman who opened the door was startled out of his studied impassivity by the sight of a big bundle of bearskin in Montague's arms. "Send for Mrs. Harrison," said Montague, and laid the bundle upon a divan in the hall. "Get a doctor as quickly as you can," he added to a second attendant. Mrs. Harrison came. "It's Mr. Grimes," said Montague, and then he heard a frightened exclamation, and turned and saw Laura Hegan in a walking costume, fresh from the cold outside. "What is it?" she cried, and he told her as quickly as he could, and she ran to help the old man. Montague stood by, and later carried him upstairs and waited below until the doctor came. It was only when he set out for home again that he found time to think about Laura Hegan, and how beautiful she looked in her furs. He wondered if it would always be his fate to meet her under circumstances which left her no time to be aware of his own existence. At home he told about his adventure, and found himself quite a hero for the rest of the day. He was obliged to give interviews to several newspaper reporters, and to refuse to let one of them take his picture. Every one at the Devons seemed to know old Harry Grimes, and Montague thought to himself that if the comments of this particular group of people were a fair sample, the poor wretch was right in saying that he had not a friend in the world. When he came downstairs the next morning, he found elaborate accounts of the accident in the papers, and learned that Grimes had nothing worse than a scalp wound and a severe shock. Even so, he felt it incumbent upon him to pay a visit of inquiry, and rode over shortly before lunch. Laura Hegan came down to see him, wearing a morning gown of white. She confirmed the good news of the papers, and said that her uncle was resting quietly. She did not say that his physician had come post haste, with 2 nurses, and taken up his residence in the house, and that the poor old millionaire was denied even his graham crackers and milk. Instead, she said that he had mentioned Montague's kindness particularly, and asked her to thank him. Montague was cynical enough to doubt this. It was the first time that he had had any occasion to talk with Miss Hegan. He noticed her gentle and caressing voice, with the least touch of the South in it, and he was glad to find that it was possible for her to talk without breaking the spell of her serene and noble beauty. Montague stayed as long as he had any right to stay, and all the way as he rode home he was thinking about Laura Hegan. Here for the first time was a woman whom he felt he should like to know, a woman with reserve and dignity and some ideas in her life, and it was impossible for him to know her, because she was rich. There was no dodging this fact. Montague did not even try. He had met women with fortunes already, and he knew how they felt about themselves, and how the rest of the world felt about them. They might wish in their hearts to be something else besides the keepers of a treasure chest, but their wishes were futile. The money went with them, and they had to defend it against all comers. Montague recalled one heiress after another, debutantes some of them, exquisite and delicate as butterflies, but under the surface as hard as chain armor. All their lives they had been trained to think of themselves as representing money, and of every one who came near them as adventurers seeking money. In every word they uttered, in every glance and motion, one might read this meaning. And then he thought of Laura Hegan, with the fortune she would inherit, and he pictured what her life must be, the toadies and parasites and flatterers who would lay siege to her, the scheming mammas and the affectionate sisters and cousins who would plot to gain her confidence. For a man who was poor, and who meant to keep his self-respect, was there any possible conclusion except that she was entirely unknowable to him? End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of the Metropolis by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Montague came back to the city, and dug into his books again, while Alice gave her spare hours to watching the progress of the new gown in which she was to uphold the honor of the family at Mrs. Devon's opening ball. The great event was due in the next week, and society was as much excited about it as a family of children before Christmas. All whom Montague met were invited, and all were going, unless they happened to be in mourning. Their gossip was all of the disappointed ones, their bitterness and heart-burning. Mrs. Devon's mansion was thrown open early on the eventful evening, but few would come until midnight. It was the fashion to attend the opera first, and previous to that half a dozen people would give big dinners. He was a fortunate person who did not hear from his liver after this occasion, for at 1 o'clock came Mrs. Devon's massive supper, and then again at 4 o'clock another supper. To prepare these repasts, a dozen extra chefs had been imported into the Devon establishment for a week, for it was part of the great lady's pride to permit no outside caterer to prepare anything for her guests. Montague had never been able to get over this wonder at the social phenomenon known as Mrs. Devon. He came and took his chances in the jostling throngs, and except that he got into casual conversation with one of the numerous detectives whom he took for a guest, he came off fairly well. But all the time that he was being passed about and introduced and danced with, he was looking about him and wondering. The grand staircase and the hall and parlors had been turned into tropical gardens, with palms and trailing vines and azaleas and roses and great vases of scarlet poinsettias, with hundreds of lights glowing through them. It was said that this ball had exhausted the flower supply of the country as far south as Atlanta. And then in the reception room one came upon the little old lady, standing beneath a bower of orchids. She was clad in a robe of royal purple trimmed with silver, and girdled about with an armor plate of gems. If one might credit the papers, the diamonds that were worn at one of these balls were valued at $20,000,000. The stranger was quite overwhelmed by all the splendor. There was a cotillion danced by 200 gorgeously clad women and their partners, a scene so gay that one could only think of it as happening in a fairy legend, or some old romance of knighthood. 4 sets of favors were given during this function, and jewels and objects of art were showered forth as if from a magician's wand. Mrs. Devon herself soon disappeared, but the riot of music and merrymaking went on till near morning, and during all this time the halls and rooms of the great mansion were so crowded that one could scarcely move about. Then one went home, and realized that all this splendor, and the human effort which it represented, had been for nothing but a memory. Nor would he get the full meaning of it if he failed to realize that it was simply one of thousands, a pattern which every one there would strive to follow in some function of his own. It was a signal bell which told the world that the season was open. It loosed the floodgates of extravagance, and the torrent of dissipation poured forth. From then on there would be a continuous round of gaieties. One might have 3 banquets every single night, for a dinner and 2 suppers was now the custom at entertainments. And filling the rest of one's day were receptions and teas and musicales. A person might take this choice among a score of opportunities, and never leave the circle he met at Mrs. Devon's. Nor was this counting the tens of thousands of aspirants and imitators all over the city, nor in a host of other cities, each with thousands of women who had nothing to do save to ape the ways of the metropolis. The mind could not realize the volume of this deluge of destruction. It was a thing which stunned the senses, and thundered in one's ears like Niagara. The meaning of it all did not stop with the people who poured it forth. Its effects were to be traced through the whole country. There were hordes of tradesmen and manufacturers whose supply was society bought, and whose study it was to induce people to buy as much as possible. And so they devised what were called fashions, little eccentricities of cut and material, which made everything go out of date quickly. There had once been 2 seasons, but now there were 4, and through window displays and millions of advertisements the public was lured into the trap. The yellow journals would give whole pages to describing what the 400 are wearing, and there were magazines with many millions of readers, which existed for nothing save to propagate these ideas. And everywhere, in all classes of society, men and women were starving their minds and hearts, and straining their energies to follow this phantom of fashion. The masses were kept poor because of it, and the youth and hope of the world was betrayed by it. In country villages poor farmers' wives were trimming their bonnets over to be stylish, and servant girls in the cities were wearing imitation sealskins, and shop clerks and seamstresses selling themselves into brothels for the sake of ribbons and gilt jewelry. It was the instinct of decoration, perverted by the money lust. In the metropolis the sole test of excellence was money, and the possession of money was the proof of power, and every natural desire of men and women had been tainted by this influence. The love of beauty, the impulse to hospitality, the joys of music and dancing and love, all these things had become simply means to the demonstration of money power. The men were busy making more money, but their idle women had nothing in life save this mad race in display. So it had come about that the women who could consume wealth most conspicuously, and who was the most effective instrument for the destroying of the labor and lives of other people, this was the woman who was most applauded and most noticed. The most appalling fact about society was this utter blind materialism. Such expectations as Montague had brought with him had been derived from the literature of Europe. In a grand monde such as this, he expected to meet diplomats and statesmen, scientists and explorers, philosophers and poets and painters, but one never heard anything about such people in society. It was a mark of eccentricity to be interested in intellectual affairs, and one might go about for weeks and not meet a person with an idea. When these people read, it was a sugar candy novel, and when they went to the play, it was a musical comedy. The one single intellectual product which it could point to as its own was a rancid scandal sheet, used mainly as a means of blackmail. Now and then some aspiring young matron of the elite would try to set up a salon after the fashion of the continent, and would gather a few feeble wits about her for a time. But for the most part, the intellectual workers of the city held themselves severely aloof, and society was left a little clique of people whose fortunes had become historic in a decade or two, and who got together in each other's palaces and gorged themselves and gambled and gossiped about each other, and wove about their personalities a veil of awful and exclusive majesty. Montague found himself thinking that perhaps it was not they who were to blame. It was not they who had set up wealth as the end and goal of things. It was the whole community, of which they were a part. It was not their fault that they had been left with power and nothing to use it for, and it was not their fault that their sons and daughters found themselves stranded in the world, deprived of all necessity and of the possibility of doing anything useful. The most pitiful aspect of the whole thing to Montague was this second generation, who were coming upon the scene, with their lives all poisoned in advance. No wrong which they could do to the world would ever equal the wrong to which the world had done them, in permitting them to have money which they had not earned. They were cut off forever from reality, and from the possibility of understanding life. They had big, healthy bodies, and they craved experience, and they had absolutely nothing to do. That was the real meaning of all this orgy of dissipation, this social whirl as it was called. It was the frantic chase of some new thrill, some excitement that would stir the senses of people who had nothing in the world to interest them. That was why they were building palaces, and flinging largeness of banquets and balls, and tearing about the country in automobiles, and traveling over the earth in steam yachts and private trains. At first and last, the lesson of their effort was that the chase was futile. The jaded nerves would not thrill. The most conspicuous fact about society was its unutterable and agonizing boredom. Of its great solemn functions the shop girls would read with greedy envy, but the women who attended them would be half asleep behind their jeweled fans. It was typified to Montague by Mrs. Billy Alden's yachting party on the Nile, yawning in the face of the Sphinx, and playing bridge beneath the shadow of the pyramids, and counting the crocodiles, and proposing to jump in by way of changing the pain. People attended these ceaseless rounds of entertainments simply because they dreaded to be left alone. They wandered from place to place, following like a herd of sheep whatever leader would inaugurate a new diversion. One could have filled a volume with the lists of their fads. There were new ones every week. If society did not invent them, the yellow journals invented them. There was a woman who had her teeth filled with diamonds, and another who was driving a pair of zebras. One heard of monkey dinners and pajama dinners at Newport, of horseback dinners and vegetable dances in New York. One heard of fashion albums and autograph fans and talking crows and rare orchids and reindeer meat, of bracelets for men and ankle rings for women, of vanity boxes at $10,000 and $20,000 each, of weird and repulsive pets, chameleons and lizards and king snakes. There was one young woman who wore a cat snake as a necklace. One would take to slumming, and another to sniffing brandy through the nose. And one had a table cover made of woven roses, and another was wearing perfumed flannel at $16 a yard. One had inaugurated ice skating in August. Another had started a class for the study of Plato. Some were giving tennis tournaments in bathing suits, and playing leapfrog after dinner. Others had got dispensation from the Pope, so that they might have private chapels and confessors. And yet others were giving progressive dinners, moving from one restaurant to another, a cocktail and blue points at Sherry's, a soup and Madeira at Delmonico's, some terrapin with Amontillado at the Waldorf, and so on. One of the consequences of the furious pace was that people's health broke down very quickly, and there were all sorts of bizarre ways of restoring it. One person would be eating nothing but spinach, and another would be living on grass. One would chew a mouthful of soup 32 times, another would eat every 2 hours, and another only once a week. Some went out early in the morning and walked barefooted in the grass. Others went hopping about the floor on their hands and knees to take off fat. There were rest cures and water cures, and new thought and metaphysical healing, and Christian Science. There was an automatic horse which one might ride indoors, with a register showing the distance traveled. Montague met one man who had an electric machine which cost $30,000, and which took hold of his arms and feet and exercised him while he waited. He met a woman who told him she was riding an electric camel. Everywhere one went, there were new people, spending their money in new and incredible ways. Here was a man who had bought a chapel and turned it into a theater, and hired professional actors and persuaded his friends to come and see him act Shakespeare. Here was a woman who costumed herself after figures in famous paintings, with arrangements of roses and cherry leaves and wreaths of ivy and laurel, and with costumes for her pet dogs to match. Here was a man who paid $6 a day for a carnation 4 inches across, and a girl who wore a hat trimmed with fresh morning glories, and a ball costume with swarms of real butterflies tied with silk threads, and another with a hat made of woven silver, with ostrich plumes 40 inches long, made entirely of silver films. Here was a man who hired a military company to drill all day long to prepare a floor for dancing, and another who put up a building at a cost of $30,000 to give a debutante dance for his daughter, and then had it torn down the day after. Here was a man who bred rattlesnakes and turned them loose by thousands, and had driven everybody away from the North Carolina estate of one of the Wallings. Here was a man who was building himself a yacht with a model dairy and bakery on board, and a French laundry and a brass band. Here was a $1,000,000 racing yacht with auto boats on it, and a platoon of marksmen, and some Chinese laundrymen, and 2 physicians for its half-insane occupant. Here was a man who had bought a Rhine castle for $750,000, and spent as much in restoring it, and filled it with servants dressed in 14th century costumes. Here was a $5,000,000 art collection hidden away where nobody ever saw it. One saw the meaning of this madness most clearly in the young men of society. Some were killing themselves, and other people in automobile races at 120 miles an hour. Some went in for auto boats, mere shells of things shaped like a knife blade that tore through the water at 40 miles an hour. Some would hire professional pugilists to knock them out. Others would get up dog fights and bear fights, and boxing matches with kangaroos. Montague was taken to the home of one young man who had given his life to hunting wild game in every corner of the globe, and would travel round the world for a new species to add to his museum of trophies. He had heard that Baron Rothschild had offered £1,000 for a bongo, a huge grass-eating animal which no white man had ever seen, and he had taken a year's trip into the interior, with a train of 130 natives, and had brought out the heads of 40 different species, including a bongo, which the Baron did not get. He met another who had helped to organize a balloon club, and 2 24-hour trips in the clouds. This, by the way, was the latest sport. At Tuxedo they had races between balloons and automobiles, and Montague met one young lady who boasted that she had been up 5 times. There was another young millionaire who sat and patiently taught Sunday school, in the presence of a host of reporters. There was another who set up a chain of newspapers all over the country, and made war upon his class. There were others who went in for settlement work and Russian revolutionists. There were even some who called themselves socialists. Montague thought that this was the strangest fad of all, and when he met one of these young men at an afternoon tea, he gazed at him with wonder and perplexity, thinking of the man he had heard ranting on the street corner. This was the second generation. Appalling as it was to think of, there was a third growing up, and getting ready to take the stage, and with wealth accumulating faster than ever. Who could guess what they might do? There were still in society a few men and women who had earned their money, and had some idea of the toil and suffering that it stood for. But when the third generation had taken possession, these would all be dead or forgotten, and there would no longer be any link to connect them with reality. In light of this thought, one was moved to watch the children of the rich. Some of these had inherited scores of millions of dollars while they were still in the cradle, and now and then one of them would be presented with $1 million house for a birthday gift. When such a baby was born, the newspapers would give pages to describing its layette, and baby dresses at $100 each, and lace handkerchiefs at $5, and dressing sets with tiny gold brushes and powder boxes. One might see a picture of the precious object in a Moses basket, covered with rare and wonderful Valenciennes lace. This child would grow up in an atmosphere of luxury and self-indulgence. It would be bullying the servants at the age of 6, and talking scandal and smoking cigarettes at 12. It would be petted and admired and stared at and paraded about in state, and dressed up like a French doll. It would drink in snobbery and hatefulness with the very air it breathed. One might meet in these great houses little tots not yet in their teens, whose talk was all of the cost of things and the inferiority of their neighbors. There was nothing in the world too good for them. They had little miniature automobiles to ride about the country in, and blooded Arabian ponies, and doll houses in real Louis Seize, with jeweled rugs and miniature electric lights. At Miss Caroline Smith's, Montague was introduced to a pale and anemic-looking youth of 13, who dined in solemn state alone when the rest of the family was away, and insisted upon having all the footmen in attendance, and his unfortunate aunt brought a storm about her ears by forbidding the butler to take champagne upstairs into the nursery before lunch. A little remark stayed in Montague's mind as expressing the attitude of society towards such matters. Major Venable had chanced to remark jestingly that children were coming to understand so much nowadays that it was necessary for the ladies to be careful. To which Mrs. Vivie Patton answered with a sudden access of seriousness, "I don't know. Do you find that children have any morals? Mine haven't." And then the fascinating Mrs. Vivie went on to tell the truth about her own children. They were natural-born savages, and that was all there was to it. They did as they pleased, and no one could stop them. The Major replied that nowadays all the world was doing as it pleased, and no one seemed able to stop it. And with that jest the conversation was turned to other matters. But Montague sat in silence, thinking about it, wondering what would happen to the world when it had fallen under the sway of this generation of spoiled children, and had adopted altogether the religion of doing as one pleased. In the beginning, people had simply done as they pleased spontaneously, and without thinking about it. But now Montague discovered the custom had spread to such an extent that it was developing a philosophy. There was springing up a new cult, whose devotees were planning to make over the world upon the plan of doing as one pleased. Because its members were wealthy and able to command the talent of the world, the cult was developing an art with a highly perfected technique, and a literature which was subtle and exquisite and alluring. Europe had had such a literature for a century, and England for a generation or two, and now America was having it too. Montague had an amusing insight into this one day, when Mrs. Vivie invited him to one of her artistic evenings. Mrs. Vivie was in touch with a special set which went in for intellectual things, and included some amateur bohemians and men of genius. "Don't you come if you'll be shocked," she had said to him, "for Strathcona will be there." Montague deemed himself able to stand a good deal by this time. He went and found Mrs. Vivie and her count. Mr. Vivie had apparently not been invited, and also the young poet of diabolism, whose work was just then the talk of the town. He was a tall, slender youth, with a white face and melancholy black eyes, and black locks falling in cascades about his ears. He sat in an oriental corner, with a manuscript copied in tiny handwriting upon delicately scented art paper, and tied with passionate purple ribbons. A young girl, clad in white, sat by his side and held a candle, while he read from this manuscript his unprinted, because unprintable, verses. And between the readings the young poet talked. He talked about himself and his work. Apparently that was what he had come to talk about. His words flowed like a swift stream, limpid, sparkling, incessant, leaping from place to place, here, there, quick as the play of light upon the water. Montague labored to follow the speaker's ideas, until he found his mind in a whirl and gave it up. Afterward, when he thought it over, he laughed at himself, for Strathcona's ideas were not serious things, having relationship to truth. They were epigrams put together to dazzle the hearers, studies in paradox with as much relation to life as fireworks. He took the sum total of the moral experience of the human race and turned it upside down and jumbled it about and used it as a bit of glass in a kaleidoscope. And the hearers would gasp and whisper, "Diabolical!" The motto of this school of poets was that there was neither good nor evil, but that all things were interesting. After listening to Strathcona for half an hour, one felt like hiding his head, and denying that he had ever thought of having any virtue, in a world where all things were uncertain. It was presumptuous even to pretend to know what virtue was. One could only be what one was, and did not that mean that one must do as one pleased? You could feel a shudder run through the company at his audacity, and the worst of it was that you could not dismiss it with a laugh, for the boy was really a poet. He had fire and passion, the gift of melodious ecstasy. He was only 20, and in his brief meteor flight he had run the gamut of all experience. He had familiarized himself with all human achievement, past, present, and future. There was nothing anyone could mention that he did not perfectly comprehend. The rapture of the saints, the consecration of the martyrs, yes, he had known them. Likewise, he had touched the depths of depravity. He had been lost in the innermost passages of the caverns of hell. And all this had been interesting in its time. Now he was sighing for new worlds of experience, save for the unrequited love which should drive him to madness. It was at this point that Montague dropped out of the race, and took to studying from the outside the mechanism of this young poet's conversation. Strathcona flouted the idea of a moral sense, but in reality he was quite dependent upon it. His recipe for making epigrams was to take what other people's moral sense made them respect, and identify it with something which their moral sense made them abhor. Thus, for instance, the tale which he told about one of the members of his set, who was a relative of a bishop. The great man had occasion to rebuke him for his profligate ways, declaring in the course of his lecture that he was living off the reputation of his father. To which the boy made the crushing rejoinder, "It may be bad to live off the reputation of one's father, but it is better than living off the reputation of God." This was very subtle, and it was necessary to ponder it. God was dead, and the worthy bishop did not know it. But let him take a new God, who had no reputation, and go out into the world and make a living out of him. Then Strathcona discussed literature. He paid his tribute to the Fleurs du Mal and the Songs before Sunrise, but most, he said, he owed to the divine Oscar. This English poet, of many poses and some vices the law had seized and flung into jail, and since the law is a thing so brutal and wicked that whoever is touched by it is made thereby a martyr and a hero, there had grown up quite a cult about the memory of Oscar. All up-to-date poets imitated his style and his attitude to life, and so most of them, revolting of vices, had the cloak of romance flung about them, were given long Greek and Latin names, and discussed with parade of learning as revivals of Hellenic ideals. The young men in Strathcona's set referred to each other as their lovers, and if one showed any perplexity over this, he was regarded, not with contempt, for it was not aesthetic to feel contempt, but with a slight lifting of the eyebrows, intended to annihilate. One must not forget, of course, that these young people were poets, and to that extent were protected from their own doctrines. They were interested, not in life, but in making pretty verses about life. There was some among them who lived his cheerful aesthetics in garret rooms and gave melodious expression to devilish emotions. But on the other hand, for every poet, there were thousands who were not poets, but people to whom life was real. And these lived out the creed and wrecked their lives, and with the aid of the poet's magic, the glamour of melody, and the fire divine, they wrecked the lives with which they came into contact. The new generation of boys and girls were deriving their spiritual sustenance from the poetry of Baudelaire and Wilde, and rushing with the hot impulsiveness of youth into the dreadful traps which the traders in vice prepared for them. One's heart bled to see them, pink-cheeked and bright-eyed, pursuing the hem of the muse's robe in brothels and dens of infamy. End of chapter 16.